She parked, got out of the car, and set out toward the avenue. She was tired and hungry, and because it's dreary to eat alone in a restaurant, she decided to have a snack in the first bistro she saw. There was a time when this neighborhood had many pleasant Breton restaurants where it was possible to eat inexpensively and pleasantly on crepes or galettes washed down with apple cider. One day, however, all these places disappeared and were replaced by modern establishments selling what is sadly known as fast food. She overcame her distaste and headed for one of them. Through the window, she saw people sitting at tables, hunched over greasy paper plates. Her eye came to rest on a girl with a very pale complexion and bright red lips. She had just finished her lunch, pushed aside her empty cup of Coca-Cola, leaned her head back, and stuck her index finger deep into her mouth. She kept twisting it inside for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The man at the next table slouched in his chair, his glance fixed on the street and his mouth wide open. It was a yawn without beginning or end, a yawn as endless as a Wagner melody. At times his mouth began to close, but never entirely. It just kept opening wide again and again, while his eyes, fixed on the street, kept opening and closing counter to the rhythm of his mouth. Actually, several other people were also yawning, showing teeth, fillings, crowns, dentures, and not one of them covered his mouth with his hand. A child in a pink dress skipped along among the tables, holding a teddy bear by its leg, and it too had its mouth wide open, though it seemed to be calling rather than yawning. Now and again the child would bump one of the guests with the teddy bear. The tables stood close together. It was obvious even through the glass that along with the food, the guests must also be swallowing the smell of their neighbor's perspiration. A wave of ugliness, visual, olfactory, and gustatory. She vividly imagined the taste of a greasy hamburger suffused by Swedish water. Hit her in the face with such force that she turned away, determined to find some other place to satisfy her hunger. The sidewalk was so crowded that it was difficult to walk. The tall shapes of two fair, yellow-haired northerners were clearing a way through the crowd ahead of her, a man and a woman looming head and shoulder over the throng of Frenchmen and Arabs. They both had a pink knapsack on their backs and a child strapped in front. In a moment she lost sight of the couple and instead saw in front of her a woman dressed in baggy trousers barely reaching the knees, as was the fashion that year. The outfit seemed to make her behind even heavier and closer to the ground. Her bare, pale calves resembled a pair of rustic pitchers decorated by varicose veins entwined like a ball of tiny blue snakes. Agnes said to herself, that woman could have found a dozen outfits that would have covered her bluish veins and made her behind less monstrous. Why hadn't she done so? Not only have people stopped trying to be attractive when they are out among other people, but they are no longer even trying not to look ugly. She said to herself, when once the onslaught of ugliness became completely unbearable, she would go to a florist and buy a forget-me-not, a single forget-me-not, a slender stalk with miniature blue flowers. She would go out into the street holding the flower before her eyes, staring at it tenaciously so as to see only that single beautiful blue point, to see it as the last thing she wanted to preserve for herself from a world she had ceased to love. She would walk like that through the streets of Paris. She would soon become a familiar sight. Children would run after her, laugh at her, throw things at her, and all Paris would call her the crazy woman with the forget-me-not. She continued on her way. Her right ear was assaulted by a tide of music, the rhythmic thumping of percussion instruments surging from shops, beauty parlors, restaurants. Her left ear picked up the sounds of the road, the composite hum of cars, the grinding rattle of a bus pulling away from a stop, then the sharp sound of a motorcycle cut through her. She couldn't help but try to find the source of this physical pain. A girl in jeans with long black hair blowing behind her sat on a small motorcycle as rigidly as if she were sitting behind a typewriter. The muffler had been removed and the bike made a terrible noise. Agnes recalled the young woman who had entered the sauna a few hours earlier, and in order to introduce herself and to force it upon others, had announced the moment she walked through the door that she hated hot showers and modesty. Agnes was certain that it was exactly the same impulse that led the black-haired girl to remove the muffler from her motorcycle. It wasn't the machine that made the noise. It was the self of the black-haired girl. In order to be heard, in order to penetrate the consciousness of others, she attached the noisy exhaust of the engine to her soul. Agnes watched the flowing hair of that blaring soul, and she realized that she yearned intensely for the girl's death. If at that moment a bus had run her over, leaving her lying in a bloody pool on the road, Agnes would have felt neither horror nor sorrow, but only satisfaction. Suddenly frightened by her hatred, she said to herself, "The world is at some sort of border. If it is crossed, everything will turn to madness. People will walk the streets holding forget-me-nots or kill one another on sight. And it will take very little for the glass to overflow, perhaps just one drop, perhaps just one car too many, or one person, or 1 decibel. There is a certain quantitative border that must not be crossed, yet no one stands guard over it, and perhaps no one even realizes that it exists." She kept walking. The sidewalk was becoming more and more crowded, and nobody bothered to move out of her way, so she stepped off the curb and continued to make her way between the edge of the sidewalk and the oncoming traffic. She had been used to doing this for a long time. People didn't get out of her way. She was aware of it. She felt it to be her misfortune and often tried to overcome it. She tried to gather courage, to walk bravely ahead, to stick to her path and force the oncoming person to give way. But she never succeeded. In this everyday, banal test of power, she was always the loser. Once a child of about 7 had walked straight at her. Agnes tried not to swerve from her path, but in the end she had no choice if she didn't wish to collide with the child. A memory came to her mind. When she was about 10 years old, she went with both her parents for a walk in the mountains. As they strolled down a broad forest path, they came upon 2 village boys standing with their arms and legs spread wide. One of them held a stick sideways as if to bar their way. "This is a private road. You must pay a toll," he shouted, and lightly touched Father's chest with his stick. It was probably just a childish prank, and all that was needed was to push the boys aside, or it was their way of begging, and Father only needed to pull a coin out of his pocket. But Father turned aside and chose to continue along a different path. In truth, it really made very little difference, since they were strolling aimlessly and didn't care where they were going. But nevertheless, Mother was angry at Father and couldn't keep from remarking, "He even gives in to a couple of 12-year-olds. Agnes, too, was somewhat disappointed by Father's behavior. A new assault of noise interrupted the recollection. Some men wearing hard hats were pounding the asphalt with pneumatic drills. Into this racket from somewhere overhead, as if from heaven, came a piano rendition of a Bach fugue. Someone on a top floor had evidently opened a window and turned up the volume all the way, so that Bach's severe beauty sounded a warning to a world that had gone awry. However, Bach's fugue was no match for the pneumatic drills and cars. On the contrary, cars and drills appropriated Bach as part of their own fugue, so that Agnes had to cover her ears with her hands and continued to walk like that down the street. At that moment, a passerby coming in the opposite direction gave her an angry glance and tapped his forehead, which in the international language of gestures says that you are crazy, scatterbrained, or weak in the head. Agnes caught that glance, that hatred, and was seized by a furious anger. She stopped. She wanted to throw herself at that person. She wanted to strike him, but she couldn't. The crowd was already pushing him along, and somebody bumped into her. Because on the sidewalk, it was impossible to stop for more than 3 seconds. She had to keep walking, but she couldn't stop thinking of him. Both of them were caught up in the same noise, and yet he found it necessary to make her understand that she had no reason and perhaps not even any right to cover her ears. That man was censoring her for the trespass of her gesture. It was equality itself that reprimanded her for refusing to undergo what everyone must undergo. It was equality itself that forbade her to disagree with the world in which all of us has to live. The longing to kill that man was not just a fleeting reaction. Even after the immediate excitement had passed, that longing remained, though it was joined by her surprise that she was capable of such hatred. The image of a person tapping his forehead floated in her innards like a fish full of poison, slowly decaying and impossible to spew out. The memory of father came back to her. Ever since she had seen him retreat from those 12-year-old boys, she often imagined him in this situation. He is on a sinking ship. There are only a few lifeboats, and there isn't room for everyone. There is a furious stampede on deck. At first, father rushes along with the others. But when he sees how they all push and shove, ready to trample each other underfoot, and a wild-eyed woman strikes him with her fist because he is in her way, he suddenly stops and steps aside. And in the end, he merely watches the overloaded lifeboats as they are slowly lowered amid shouts and curses toward the raging waves. What name to give this attitude? Cowardice? No. Cowards are afraid of dying and will fight to survive. Nobility? Undoubtedly. If he had acted out of regard for his fellows. But Agnes did not believe this was his motive. What was it then? She couldn't say. Only one thing seemed certain. On a sinking ship where it was necessary to fight in order to board a lifeboat, father would have been condemned in advance. Yes, that much was certain. The question that arises is this: had father hated the people on the ship, just as she now hates the motorcyclist and the man who mocked her because she covered her ears? No. Agnes cannot imagine that father was capable of hatred. Hate traps us by binding us too tightly to our adversary. This is the obscenity of war. The intimacy of mutually shed blood, the lascivious proximity of two soldiers who eye to eye bayonet each other. Agnes was sure it was precisely this kind of intimacy that father found repugnant. Wow, that's fantastic. The melee on the ship filled him with such disgust that he preferred to drown. The physical contact with people who struck and trampled and killed one another seemed far worse to him than a solitary death in the purity of the waters. Fantastic. The memory of father began to deliver her from the hatred that had possessed her. Little by little, the poisonous image of a man tapping his forehead disappeared, and in its place a phrase came into her mind. I cannot hate them because nothing binds me to them. I have nothing in common with them. Unbelievable.